The waiting room was quiet, save for the occasional shuffle of papers from the receptionist's desk. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair, glancing at the clock on the wall for what felt like the 100th time. It wasn't that I minded waiting. It was the anticipation that made it unbearable. Knowing I'd soon be alone in a room with Dr. Bennett. Dr. Ethan Bennett wasn't like any other physician I'd had before. He was warm, attentive, and disarmingly charming. His deep, calming voice could put anyone at ease, but it was the way he looked at you, like he really saw you, that had a way of making my pulse race. Of course, none of that was appropriate to think about, especially when he was my doctor. But I couldn't help it. The receptionist called my name, snapping me out of my thoughts. I stood quickly, smoothing my shirt as I followed her to the exam room. She gestured for me to take a seat, informing me that Dr. Bennett would be with me shortly. The door closed behind her, leaving me alone in the small, sterile space. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. The familiar surroundings, the examination table, the medical equipment, the faint scent of antiseptic, should have been enough to ground me. But the knowledge that Dr. Bennett would be walking through that door any moment made my heart race. A soft knock at the door broke the silence, and before I could respond, it opened. Dr. Bennett stepped inside, a clipboard in hand and a warm smile on his face. He was dressed in his usual attire, a crisp white coat over a button-up shirt and slacks, but today, the top button of his shirt was undone, giving him a slightly more relaxed appearance. His dark hair was neatly combed, but a single strand had fallen loose over his forehead, and I found myself resisting the urge to reach out and brush it back. "Good to see you, Aaron," he said, his tone genuinely welcoming. "How have you been?" I managed to smile, though my voice wavered slightly as I replied. "Good, just busy with work, you know." He nodded, setting his clipboard on the counter as he leaned against it. "I hear that a lot. It's easy to let life get in the way of taking care of yourself." His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I felt as though the air had been knocked out of me. There was something about the way he looked at me, steady, thoughtful, and entirely unguarded, that made my chest tighten. "Well, that's why I'm here," I said, forcing a small laugh to break the tension. Dr. Bennett chuckled softly, his lips curving into a faint smile that sent a warmth through me. He reached for his stethoscope, his movements unhurried as he motioned for me to sit on the exam table. "Let's take a look then." I climbed onto the table, my heart pounding as he approached. The air between us felt charged, though I told myself it was nothing more than my overactive imagination. He was just doing his job, I reminded myself. Nothing more. But when his hand rested lightly on my shoulder as he positioned the stethoscope against my chest, I couldn't ignore the shiver that ran through me. His touch was firm, yet gentle, his fingers warm against my skin. "Take a deep breath for me," he said, his voice low and soothing. I did as he asked, my breath hitching slightly as his gaze met mine. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his expression, something that mirrored the longing I'd been trying so hard to suppress. But before I could dwell on it, he pulled back, his professional demeanor firmly in place. Dr. Bennett moved to jot something down on the clipboard, his back turned to me. I tried to steady my breathing, forcing myself to focus on the mundane details of the room, the cool metal of the exam table beneath me, the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. But my gaze kept drifting back to him. The way his shoulders moved beneath his coat, the way his jaw tightened slightly as he concentrated. It was maddening how easily he captured my attention. When he turned back, his expression was calm, unreadable, but his eyes lingered on mine just a second too long. "Your heart rate's a little elevated," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching in what might have been a suppressed smile. "Anything you're nervous about?" His words sent a rush of heat to my face, and I scrambled for an excuse. "No, I guess I'm not used to being in here," I said awkwardly, my voice a bit too quick. Dr. Bennett raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he stepped closer again, his hand brushing against mine as he reached for the blood pressure cuff. The contact was brief, almost incidental, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. "Let's check your blood pressure," he said, his tone even. He wrapped the cuff around my arm, his fingers grazing my skin in a way that felt both clinical and impossibly intimate. I tried to focus on the rhythmic sound of the pump as he inflated the cuff, but the proximity was overwhelming. I could feel the faint warmth of his breath as he leaned in, his gaze flicking to mine before he adjusted the dial. "It's a bit high," he said after a moment, releasing the pressure. "Probably just stress." His eyes softened slightly, and he added, "Anything going on that might be weighing on you?" The question felt loaded, though I knew he didn't mean it that way. Or at least, I told myself he didn't. "Just work," I said quickly. "Nothing out of the ordinary." Dr. Bennett nodded, but his gaze lingered, his eyes searching mine as if he could see through the thin veneer of my words. "If there's ever anything you need to talk about, you know you can," he said softly, his tone dipping into something warmer, more personal. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and for a moment I couldn't find the words to respond. My chest tightened, and I felt the weight of something unspoken settle between us. He seemed to sense it too, his hand hovering just a fraction of an inch too long on my arm before he stepped back. "Let's finish up here," he said, his voice quieter now. He moved to the counter again, writing notes with a focus that felt almost forced, as though he were trying to distance himself from whatever had just passed between us. The tension in the room was suffocating, and I felt like I was balancing on the edge of something I didn't fully understand. But when he finally turned back, his gaze softer now, the faintest hint of a smile on his lips, I couldn't help but feel like that edge was exactly where I wanted to be. As the appointment wrapped up, I found myself hesitating, my fingers clutching the strap of my bag as I stood by the door. Dr. Bennett's voice broke through the silence, gentle but firm. "Aaron," he said, and I turned to find him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite place. "Yeah?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. He hesitated for just a moment, as if weighing his words. "I meant what I said earlier. If there's ever anything you need, don't hesitate to reach out." The way he said it, the way his gaze held mine, felt heavier than it should have. I nodded, my chest tight as I murmured, "Thanks, Doctor." "Bennett." "Ethan," he corrected, his voice soft. "You can call me Ethan." The familiarity of his first name sent a shiver through me, and I nodded again, the corners of my mouth twitching in a faint smile. "Ethan," I said, the word feeling foreign but natural on my tongue. As I stepped out of the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the fragile line between professional and personal had blurred in a way that couldn't be undone. And as I walked down the hallway, my mind racing, I realized I wasn't sure if I wanted to undo it. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't quite pin down. I replayed every moment of the appointment in my mind, dissecting every glance, every word, every touch. I told myself I was overthinking it, that whatever tension I'd felt was one-sided, a product of my own wishful thinking. But the memory of Ethan's eyes on me, the way his voice softened when he said my name, refused to fade. It wasn't until a week later that I saw him again, entirely by chance. I was at the corner coffee shop, waiting in line when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Aaron." I turned to find Ethan standing there dressed in a fitted sweater and dark jeans, a far cry from the clinical white coat I was used to seeing him in. His smile was warm, easy, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. "Ethan," I said, the name feeling strange but right. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Likewise," he said, stepping closer. "Mind if I join you?" I nodded, the nervous flutter in my chest making it hard to form words. We ordered our drinks and found a quiet table by the window, the sunlight streaming in and casting a soft glow over his features. He looked relaxed, more so than I'd ever seen him, and it only made the tension coiling in my stomach worse. The conversation started light, work, the weather, the latest headlines, But there was an undercurrent of something else, something unspoken that lingered in the spaces between our words. I found myself drawn to him in a way that felt both exhilarating and terrifying, every laugh, every glance pulling me deeper into the gravity of his presence. When our drinks were finished and the conversation lulled, Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady on mine. "This was nice," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I don't get to do this often." "Neither do I admitted, my fingers fidgeting with the empty cup in front of me. "It's refreshing." Ethan's lips curved into a small smile, and he tilted his head slightly, studying me. "I'm glad we ran into each other," he said. "It feels easy." "Yeah," I said, my chest tightening at the honesty in his tone. "It does." The moment stretched between us, heavy with unspoken possibilities, and I felt myself teetering on the edge of something I couldn't name. But before I could dwell on it, Ethan stood, his hand brushing lightly against mine as he gathered his things. "Take care of yourself, Aaron," he said, his voice quiet but meaningful. "You too," I replied, my throat tight as I watched him leave. As I sat there, the sunlight streaming through the window, I realized that whatever had started in that exam room wasn't over. It was just beginning. The days after our unexpected coffee shop meeting were filled with a strange, undeniable energy. I told myself that it was just a casual encounter, a friendly conversation, nothing more. But the way Ethan had looked at me, the softness in his voice when he said my name, lingered like a melody I couldn't shake. When my phone buzzed 2 days later, I didn't expect it to be him. Seeing his name light up my screen made my heart race in a way I couldn't ignore. "Hope you don't mind me texting." I wanted to check in. Any lingering stress from the last appointment? I stared at the message, my mind racing. It was a perfectly reasonable question, something any good doctor might ask. But the way it was phrased felt different, casual, personal. I hesitated for only a moment before replying. "No stress. Feeling good. Thanks for checking in." The response was safe, neutral, but the flutter in my chest betrayed how much his message affected me. A few moments later, my phone buzzed again. "Glad to hear it. If you ever need a break from work, coffee's on me next time." I read the message twice, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Was this crossing a line? Or was I just overthinking it? Before I could second-guess myself, I typed a reply. "I might take you up on that." His response came almost instantly. "Looking forward to it." Our second coffee meeting wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, planned, and yet somehow just as charged with unspoken tension. We met at the same cafe, the familiar hum of chatter and the smell of roasted beans creating a bubble that felt separate from the rest of the world. Ethan was already there when I arrived, his presence commanding even in the casual setting. He wore a simple navy sweater, his sleeves pushed up to reveal strong forearms, and his hair was slightly tousled, as though he hadn't put much thought into it. He looked human. Not the calm, collected doctor I'd first met, but something more approachable, more real. "Aaron," he said, standing as I approached. His smile was warm, genuine, and it disarmed me immediately. "Ethan," I replied, taking the seat across from him. The sound of his name on my lips felt both strange and exhilarating. We talked for hours, the conversation flowing easily from one topic to the next. Ethan asked about my work, my interests, my life outside the clinic, and I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't expected. He was attentive, genuinely interested, and the way he leaned forward when I spoke made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. At one point, as I was recounting a particularly funny story from work, he laughed, a deep, warm sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "You're something else, you know that?" he said, his tone light but with an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. I froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. "What do you mean?" Ethan's smile softened, and he shook his head slightly. "You're easy to be around," he said simply. "It's rare." His words sent a warmth through me, and I felt my cheeks flush. "I could say the same about you," I said quietly. The air between us shifted then, the hum of the cafe fading into the background as our eyes met. For a moment it felt as though we were the only two people in the room, the weight of everything unspoken hanging heavily in the air. Ethan cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "I should let you get back to your day," he said, though his tone was reluctant. "Yeah," I said, though I didn't want to leave. "Thanks for this." "Any time," he replied, his eyes holding mine. "And I mean that." As I walked away, my chest tight with a mix of emotions I couldn't fully name, I realized that whatever this was, it wasn't something I could ignore. And judging by the way Ethan had looked at me, I wasn't the only one who felt it. The next time we saw each other, it was back at the clinic. I'd scheduled a follow-up appointment, though I wasn't entirely sure it was necessary. Part of me wondered if I was imagining the connection between us, if I'd built it up in my mind as something more than it was. But when Ethan walked into the room, his smile brighter than usual, I knew I hadn't been imagining anything. "Aaron," he said warmly. "Good to see you again." "You too," I replied, my voice steady despite the flutter in my chest. The appointment started like any other. Routine questions, brief examinations. But the tension between us was impossible to ignore. Every touch, every glance felt charged, and I found myself holding my breath whenever he came close. When the appointment was nearly over, Ethan hesitated, his hand resting on the counter as he looked at me. "There's something I need to say," he began, his voice quieter now. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited, unsure of what was coming. "I know this isn't typical," he said, his gaze steady. "And I know it's not exactly professional, but I can't ignore the fact that I look forward to seeing you. Here, out there, anywhere. And I need to know if I'm the only one who feels that." The vulnerability in his voice, the openness in his expression, took my breath away. I felt the weight of his words settle over me, and for a moment I couldn't find the right response. "You're not the only one," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I've been trying to ignore it, but I can't." Ethan's shoulders relaxed slightly, and a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "I don't know where this goes," he admitted, "but I want to find out, if you're willing." I nodded, my chest tight with a mix of fear and anticipation. "I am." The air between us was electric, the unspoken tension finally breaking as Ethan stepped closer. He reached out, his hand brushing lightly against mine before he pulled back, his gaze steady. "Let's figure it out," he said softly. And in that moment, I knew there was no going back. Ethan's words lingered in the air, a quiet promise that echoed in my chest long after I left the clinic. I replayed the moment in my mind 100 times, analyzing every glance, every word, every touch. The way his hand had brushed mine, deliberate but hesitant, sent a thrill through me that I couldn't shake. Whatever line we'd crossed, it wasn't something I regretted. The following days were a whirlwind of text that started out casual but quickly became something more. His messages weren't overtly romantic, but the undercurrent was undeniable. A check-in about my health turned into a conversation about my favorite music, which spiraled into late-night exchanges about life, dreams, and everything in between. It wasn't long before Ethan suggested we meet again, this time outside the clinic. Dinner Friday? No stethoscope involved. I stared at the message, my heart racing. This wasn't just coffee. This was intentional, deliberate, a step toward something neither of us had dared to name. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before I typed a reply. I'd like that. When Friday arrived, I felt a nervous energy buzzing under my skin as I got ready. I'd spent far too much time choosing what to wear, second-guessing every decision, but when I finally arrived at the restaurant, all my nerves melted away the moment I saw him. Ethan was waiting near the entrance, dressed in a charcoal blazer over a dark sweater that highlighted his broad shoulders and lean frame. His smile was warm and genuine, and I felt my chest tighten at the sight of him. "Aaron," he said, stepping forward to greet me. His hand brushed my arm lightly, the touch sending a shiver down my spine. "You look great." "Thanks," I said, my voice a little breathless. "You too." The restaurant was intimate, dimly lit with soft music playing in the background. Ethan led the way to our table, his presence steady and reassuring. As we sat down, I couldn't help but notice how at ease he seemed, his usual calm confidence tempered by a hint of nervousness that made him even more endearing. The conversation flowed easily, just as it always had. We talked about work, hobbies, and our favorite places in the city. Ethan shared stories about his med school days, his laugh warm and genuine as he recounted the more ridiculous moments. I found myself relaxing, the initial tension giving way to a quiet sense of comfort. But beneath the surface, the tension between us simmered, unspoken but undeniable. Every time his hand brushed mine as he reached for his glass or leaned closer to make a point, I felt the spark of something electric. His gaze lingered a fraction longer than necessary, his smile softer, more intimate. By the time dessert arrived, I was acutely aware of how close we were sitting, our knees brushing under the table. Ethan's hand rested casually on the edge of the table, inches from mine, and I found myself inching closer without realizing it. "Aaron," he said softly, his voice cutting through the hum of the restaurant. His gaze met mine, and the weight of his expression made my breath catch. I've been wanting to say this for a while. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding as I waited. "I don't know where this is going," he admitted, his voice steady but laced with vulnerability. "But I know I don't want to pretend there's nothing here. Because there is." The honesty in his words, the quiet conviction, left me speechless. My chest tightened, a mix of fear and longing swirling inside me. "I feel it too," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper,